Well, last year there was a bit of a controversy in the world of country music. I don't know if you are in that world or not. I am not personally, but I read the story. I thought some of you would like it, so I'm going to share it this morning. It revolved around an artist. His name was Lil Nas X, who released a song called Old Town Road, which today is considered a rap country song. But at the time it came out, and nobody knew what this was exactly, and it entered the country charts because it went viral online. On the country charts, it was the number one song. Now, there's a problem with it, is that some listened to the song and said, that's not a country song. I mean, it had some things. It was sung with a little bit of a drawl, and it had some country instrumentation. The song's about horses. I mean, come on, that kind of settles it for me. But people thought, I don't know that this is a song. He's rapping in the middle of it. And so there was all this opposition that came up. And there was a controversy. And after all this kickback, and other artists were saying, this isn't fair, it's not a country song, it was taken off the Billboard top country songs. If you're not familiar, Billboard is the charting organization that charts and follows the most listened to and most purchased songs. So in the midst of all this opposition, the song was taken off. But Lil Nas X got the last laugh. Because in spite of all this opposition, there was so much press and so much controversy that the song re-entered not the country charts, but the Billboard Top 100, and it stayed there in the top spot, top of all songs, for like 17 weeks, which set a record for the most time a song has spent ever in that spot since 1958, when the chart was created. So in the midst of this opposition came an opportunity. And in a great story of irony, this song, he redid this song with Billy Ray Cyrus, and it entered the charts, ironically, the country charts, and took the number one spot. So the lesson is, if you want to get on the Billboard charts, record a song with the Achy Breaky Heart guy, right? Yeah, I think that's pretty good. Also, maybe better for this morning, is that the point here is that when you're facing opposition, sometimes through that opposition, you will find opportunity, and maybe even greater opportunity than you wouldn't have gotten in the first place. And so the lesson there for us, I believe, as a community, is to keep our eyes on the truth and keep our eyes on God, even in the face of opposition. So this is our subject this morning. And this is the question I want us all to wrestle with, is this question: what do you do when the world is against you? Or maybe better, what do you do when you feel like the world is against you? I believe that this is a really important question, and I think most of us would agree that in most cases, it feels like that as Christians. It feels like that in our country. As we're wrestling, especially with our faith, we're wrestling with this, and it just seems like more and more, doesn't it? Like people or the world is against Christianity. This week in our nation's capital, there are conversations about what does it mean to have faith, and what does it mean for that faith to influence the decisions that you make. There's some very important conversations going on. And it just feels more and more in the last few decades like the tides have turned, and there's more and more opposition to Christianity. Now, I just want to say, to be fair, it seems like peanuts compared to what the persecution that some Christians are facing in most other countries, and yet it's hard to lose something that you have. And so what do you do when the world's against you? Maybe that question is more personal for you. Maybe for some of you, you grew up in a family where you didn't go to church, and your family didn't follow Jesus, you weren't Christians, and somewhere in your life story, God grabbed a hold of your heart and you became a follower of Him. And yet now, even though that's a good thing, you found that there's some tension in your family. When you're around them, they don't understand your decisions. They don't know why you feel that way. It feels like when you get together with them, there's tension, like the world is against you. Or maybe you go to school, and you feel like you have friends and classmates who just don't understand the same things or feel the same way about things that you do, and so you feel like the world's against you. I'll just be honest. Probably the toughest time in my own life was when I was in high school, and I had to wrestle with, what does it mean to follow Jesus? And I went to a school, there were 600 kids in my graduating class. And I'm not saying there weren't any, but I didn't know anyone who was really trying to follow Jesus, anyone else. I remember there was one kid, he would wear a bright orange shirt with the Reese's Peanut Butter Cup logo on it, and instead of Reese's, it said Jesus. That was the closest I ever saw to anyone trying to follow Jesus, or I knew. That was about the extent of it. And so I had to wrestle with, what does it mean to follow Jesus when it seems like nobody else is thinking about that? What do you do when it feels like the world is against you? If you don't feel like that now, there will be times in your life you feel like that. And this is how I can be so sure of that, because Jesus pretty much guarantees it. He says this. This is in Matthew chapter 10, verse 22. Jesus said, he's beginning a thought here. He says, you will be hated by everyone because of me. I'm just going to stop it there. Look at the power of that statement. Jesus, speaking to us as Christians, says, you will be hated, not some people are going to dislike you. It's going to be kind of awkward sometimes. He says, you're going to be hated, and not by a few people, not by mean people. He says, by everyone. You'll be hated by everyone. He's talking here to the Christian community, to his followers, and everyone here is the outside world. Because we're in the midst of a cosmic battle, and the world is against God and the things of God. And so he says, if you follow Jesus and you do what's right, you will, guarantee, you will face opposition. So what can we do? Now, we'll get into the book of Nehemiah, I promise, but here's our thought this morning. If you take away anything, take away this. That when opposition comes from all sides, we must let God fight for us. This is, I believe, what Nehemiah chapters 4 and 6 that we'll look at this morning tells us loud and clear. When opposition comes from all sides, when it feels like the world's against you, you must let God fight for you. And so you're probably thinking, what in the world does that mean? How do I let God fight for me? Do I do nothing? What does that look like? Well, we're going to see that this morning, so I'll have you grab a Bible or pull out a device, if you haven't so far, and you can turn to the book of Nehemiah, chapter 4. Now, if you haven't been with us the last few weeks, we've been digging through this book. Even last week, Pastor Lee Eklov was with us. I so appreciate him coming and bringing God's word. I especially like when a guest comes and stays in a series. And so we've been going through the last 3 weeks through chapters 1, 2, and 3 of Nehemiah. And if you're not familiar with the story, or if you don't remember, that's okay. Here's how it starts. With a man named Nehemiah. He's a Jewish man. He loves the Lord. He's in a place called Persia. And God calls him back to Jerusalem, what had been called the Promised Land, back to where the nation of Israel had been, and he's going to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. So he gets all the people who are there, the Jewish people, and he says, let's start rebuilding the wall. And they rally around it, and they start rebuilding this wall. We're going to see the full construction of it, or most of it, this morning. I just want to point out, because we haven't talked about this yet, here's why this is important. Because you might wonder, why a wall? Why not the temple or something else or the palace? Why is the wall so important? And it might not be what you think. In those days, the wall, when you saw a city with a wall, it represented power. That you're entering the city, it's glorious, it's protected, and it was a sign for the followers of God that God was protecting them. It was basically a sign of God's strength. This was the city where David was king. It was God's city, the capital city. So it was a sign of God's power. Well, you can kind of think of it like the flag in America. Think of your flag, and you see the flag, and you feel pride. Why? Not because that flag is anything important, the cloth isn't important, but because that flag represents something that's great, your country. It's a sign pointing to something else. And this is what the wall was. This was a sign. It's not that, oh man, we need a wall, the wall is great. It was that their God was great. And they knew by this emblem, so to speak, this sign, that it was showing the greatness of God. So I don't want you to think, as we're going through Nehemiah, that the wall is something special. It was God who was special. And the people knew that. And so they're on a mission from God. This is what God had put in their hearts. And so what we're going to do in the next 3 chapters, chapters 4, 5, and 6, we see all this opposition coming up. We'll be talking about opposition for the next 2 weeks, because there's 2 kinds of opposition. One is from the outside. We'll talk about that today. We see it in chapters 4 and then later in chapter 6. But then sandwiched between them in chapter 5, we see the opposition coming, or frustration coming from inside the community itself. We'll talk about that next week. So we're going to be skipping around a little bit, chapters 4 and 6 this morning. But I want you to just jump in with me, chapter 4. And you'll see, because of the time constraints in 2 chapters, we're not going to walk through all of this. But right away, you'll see it mentions a couple of people we've heard about before. One is Sanballat, is his name. He's the governor of Samaria. One is a guy by the name of Tobiah, the Ammonite. You'll see him in verse 3. And they're very angry. We've seen them before. They're upset that this wall is being built. Because as soon as people start doing God's work, people don't like it, and so people from the outside are raising up against it. And if you look in those first few verses, you'll just see the anger of what's going on. If there was like a red letter version of the Bible, but instead of the words of Jesus, the red represented anger and hate, this would be covered in blood red. There is so much. Look at some of the words here. Sanballat became angry, greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, so he's mocking them with sarcasm. They're despised. There's insults, sins, blot out, insults. Again, these are the words that are being used here. And the point is, there are people who don't like what's happening. And then we see the full extent of it. Verses 7 and 8, if you jump with me there, it says this. But when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the people of Ashdod heard that repairs to Jerusalem's walls had gone ahead and that the gaps were being closed, they were very angry. There's another one of those words. They all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against it. So notice, Nehemiah is telling this story. He's saying the people are angry, they're upset, they don't like that the walls are being built, they're against God and his people. And so, notably, they're upset. But I want you to notice the people that are told who are against it. Now, most of these names mean nothing to us, Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites. But here's what's interesting. If you're familiar with the geography at the time, is that the people mentioned are in different directions. Sanballat was the governor, we know from other sources, of Samaria. Samaria was to the north. The Arabs would have been to the south of Jerusalem. The Ammonites were to the east, across the Jordan River. And the people of Ashdod is the capital of the Philistines, or was the capital of the Philistines. And it was in the west. It separated the people from the Mediterranean Sea. Here's the point. It's listing off names. I believe this is intentional. North, south, east, west. Here's the point. Everyone was against them. It goes this way. Everyone was against them. The people don't like what's going on, and it feels like the whole world is against them. Again, there's probably times you feel like this. Maybe you're in a group and you just feel like everyone seems to be opposed to what you're doing. And it only got worse. Verse 10, we're told, meanwhile, the people in Judah said, the strength of the laborers is giving out, and there is so much rubble that we cannot rebuild the wall. So the people are getting discouraged when you face opposition and people are always against you and picking on you. You start to get discouraged. Is this really what we're supposed to be doing? Is this really right? Did we make a mistake? Is God really in this? Is this going to work out? I don't know if we're going to make it. Maybe we should give up. But Nehemiah rallies the troops, figuratively and literally. He puts guards around the walls, and they're protecting the people from what's happening, and then they just get to work. And then we're told, and here's where I want to pick up and camp out for a little bit. Starting in verse 19, we're told this, and Nehemiah again is telling us the story. He says, then I said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, the work is extensive and spread out, and we are widely separated from each other along the wall. And then he tells his people, wherever you hear the sound of the trumpet, join us there. Our God will fight for us. Your Bibles, if you have a utensil, I want you to highlight, circle, underline that last phrase. Our God will fight for us. This is what is in Nehemiah. This is what gives him confidence. He goes, all this stuff is going on, but God is going to fight for us. And he has confidence in the Lord. He knows that God this is God's plan. God called them to do this, and the Lord is going to fight for them. And you wonder, let's be honest, what does that mean? Again, what does it mean to let God fight for us? So the rest of the morning, I want to give you, based on Nehemiah 4 and 6, the do's and don'ts of letting God fight for you. If you're a real stickler, you'll call them the don'ts and do's. That's how it's going to go, but it's do's and don'ts sound better. So we'll go to the don'ts first. But here's what we learned from Nehemiah. First, don't sit around and wait. Letting God fight for you is not sitting around and waiting for him to take action. Now, you got to admit, it sounds like that. Like if you were a kid and you were being bullied on the playground and your mom told you, hey, let your brother fight for you. He's older. That would mean, like, don't do anything. Let him do the work. It's okay. He's got this. But that's not what Nehemiah is saying when he says, just sit around and wait. That's not at all what's going on. And that's not what Nehemiah is doing. Notice in verse 9. And this is in the context of the Bible, a very interesting verse. It's very simple. But Nehemiah says, we prayed to our God, not a period, keeps going, and posted a guard day and night to meet this threat. Forget about the conflict in Jerusalem. There was conflict in this sentence. Look at it again. We prayed to our God. We prayed to our God. That should have been it, right? But it wasn't. He said, and posted a guard. Notice the and the importance of that and. He's saying, we prayed, we had faith in God, and we took action. Remember, Nehemiah is a man of prayer and a man of action. They're not different. In fact, when the Bible talks about prayer, it assumes an action. When you're facing opposition, here's the first thing to remember. It doesn't mean that God's calling you to just do nothing and sit around and watch the show. He wants to work through you, but we need to pray and trust him. And then the flip side of that is don't sit around and wait, but do pour yourself into the work God has given you. Pour yourself into the work God has given you. We see this here. Again, a few verses before this. Verse 6, Nehemiah is telling the story. So we built the wall till all of it reached half of its height, so they'd have to work. For the people worked with all their heart. In English, it's lost a little bit, but the word here, heart, is a Hebrew word which means like your whole being, or like your whole life. He's saying they worked with all their life. Everything that they had inside of them, they put towards this wall because it was what God had called them to do. There we go. God had called them to build a wall. Here's why that's important. Their energy went into God's work, not the opposition. And here's where I think everybody, and sometimes Christians, often Christians, make a mistake. Is we focus so much on the opposition, we take our eyes off the task, and I believe that is a scheme of Satan, that we fall for that trap because we think, well, I'm not giving in, but we are, in a way, getting our eyes off of what's really important. And it begins to consume us, the opposition. How dare they? How dare they say that? Can you believe that? I can't believe they're lying. That's not true. Man, that bothers me. That stinks. But we've taken our eyes off the project the mission that God has given us. I wonder sometimes in our country the way that the church responds, and by the church I mean Christians everywhere. Sometimes I wonder if we don't spend so much time speaking out against the opposition that we're not telling people about Jesus, we're not giving hope to the world, we're not loving on others, the things that we're called to do because we're so focused on the opposition. But notice the people don't do that. They pour their energy into what God had called them to do. In this case, it just happened to be a wall because it represented God's glory. We must do the same. We must remember why we're here, what God had called us to do, for love and hope and the gospel, most importantly, and keep our eyes on Jesus. Charles Spurgeon, the famous preacher, lived a little more than 100 years ago. And he once was just a very famous, well-known preacher, and he once told his students, they were young pastors, he said, pray as if everything depended on God, then preach as if everything depended on you. I think that Nehemiah would say amen to that. We see this in his life. He prayed for 4 months before he took any action, but then he went and stood before the king. Pray and ask God for help. But then remember that God has given you work to do, to pour your heart into the gospel and to sharing the good news with others. The second don't we see, don't retreat. Nehemiah tells us not to retreat. I'll have you at this point, once you're done with that little line on your note sheet, you can turn to chapter 6. This is after the wall is almost finished. The wall is almost complete here. And we see the opposition ramp up. So the opposition is getting more and more angry. They're getting upset. They're getting desperate. They start making up stories and trying whatever they can do to stop Nehemiah and the Jewish people. And so there's these letters being sent to Nehemiah. The opposition says they're going to tattle basically on Nehemiah, and his fellow Jews are telling him, hey, just give up. Just let's run away. We did a good job. It's almost done. Let's just be done. And Nehemiah responds by saying this. Verse 11, I said, should a man like me run away? Assumed answer, no. Or should someone like me go into the temple to save his life? No. I will not go. So he declines to run away. As people are saying, go, just run the temple, hide. He's not going to do that. He's not going to run away, even though his advisors are telling him to. This is very similar. About a month ago, we were finishing up one of the last messages in our Psalm series, looking at Psalm 11. And the context of that psalm is a psalm of David, was that David was running from Saul, and his advisors were telling him, if you remember, it's in like the second or third verse, flee like a bird to the mountain. That's what they were saying. Get out of here. Retreat. Fly like an eagle to the sea. That was his advisor, Steve Miller. I don't know if you heard of him. All right, there's your rock reference. We got country music, rock. If you like classical music, you're out. I don't have any Beethoven jokes, but there were your references. Okay, we'll move on. So his advisors are telling him, get out of here, get a move on it. Time keeps on slipping into the future. You got to go, but he will not go. He will not retreat because he knows that it's a temptation to walk away and retreat, but he's not going to do it. Now, it's true, like your mom told you, sometimes the best thing to do is to walk away, but not when you're walking away from something God has called you to do. So instead of retreating, don't retreat, do pursue the truth. Do pursue the truth. I love this. This is one of my favorite parts of this passage. I think it's powerful. Here we have Nehemiah, and if you look, and I would encourage you later this week to read this story. We don't have time to cover it all. But Sanballat sends 4 times and then a 5th time a letter to Nehemiah, and he basically makes up a story. He says, if you don't stop, I'm going to write the king of Persia, you know this king, and I'm going to tell him that you're revolting and trying to become king of Jerusalem. Now, that was a huge threat in those days if you were revolting against the kingdom. And so he's threatening to tell the king this, to write him a letter. And Nehemiah would be in huge danger, but Nehemiah responds, verse 8, I sent him this reply. Nothing like what you are saying is happening. You are just making it up out of your head. I love that response. I think I love that response because when opposition comes, oftentimes what comes next is lies. Stretching the truth, taking things out of context. And Nehemiah simply says, nah, that's not true, and then goes about his work. He focuses on the truth. I think sometimes we fall for another scheme, and that is we get caught up in the lies, or we start doing the same thing, coming up with stories to get back at our opposition. Instead, we should be focusing on the truth. Remember, our Savior Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. One of the names he gave himself was the truth. Jesus is the truth. And so, as followers of Jesus, we should be people of the truth. And we should focus on the truth, and we should treasure the truth, whatever it is. There are a few areas where I think this is helpful for us. One is on social media. In a time where studies have shown more and more the things coming across people's feeds are things that are either not true at all or they're stretching the truth. And sometimes we might read a story and we might think, I really like this story. It fits how I feel, but sometimes we should go the extra step and just ask, is what I'm sharing or what I'm posting or what I'm liking or what I'm telling people, is it actually true? You ever heard this? Heard someone say, I don't know if this story is true or not, but I heard, then don't spread it. I think as Christians, the truth should be important. We should vet things that we hear. There's some excellent tools online, some fact-checking sites. Often if I read something and I go, I don't know if this is true or not, you can Google it and you can find out on a website. It'll tell you where it came from or if it's true or not. I think that should be important to us. It was important to Nehemiah what was true and what was not. It's important in how we handle gossip, if we spread it or not. When we gossip, at best, we muddle the truth. At worst, we directly oppose the truth and spread things that are false. Before we share things, we should be sure what we're sharing is actually true. And what's the intention? Matthew Mitchell, he's a pastor. He wrote a book on gossip, and he shares his definition of gossip. I think it's really good. He says, sinful gossip is bearing bad news behind someone's back out of a bad heart. Now that last part, bad heart, is getting at what Jesus said. He said anything that comes out of your mouth is really coming from your heart, where your thoughts are inside of you. And so it's coming out. So what's really going on? What's the intention? Why are you sharing this? But gossip is bearing bad news, so something bad or negative, behind somebody's back. I think that's a helpful definition for all of us in thinking, what am I actually saying? Why am I giving this information? Does it help anything for me to tell this story? And am I sharing bad news about somebody's back? Is this gossip? If we're not 100% that it's 100% sure it's true, we're spreading things possibly that are false. What is your intention in sharing this information? Are you helping anything? And then lastly, we pursue the truth. When we face opposition and we admit sometimes we're wrong. Anytime we're wrong, when we admit and we confess and we ask for forgiveness, you might not think of it this way, but you're actually truth-telling. When you say, listen, I messed up, that's on me, I shouldn't have done that, that's telling the truth. That's focusing on the truth and asking for forgiveness. And so as followers of Jesus, we should be pursuing what's true because our Savior is truth. And then lastly, don't seek your opposition's demise. The last don't of the morning. Nehemiah prays a lot in this book. We'll see it. We've seen it a ton. We'll see it again. But he prays a couple times in our passages this morning. One is in chapter 4. Starting in verse 4, he prays this. He says, "Hear us, O God, for we are despised. Turn their insults," he's talking about his opponents, "turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders." Now these next 2 points, I want to read between the lines a little bit. I want you to see, you see that prayer, and it's definitely not a good prayer for his enemies. He's praying that they would face the punishment for what they've done. But here's what's really important. Notice his concentration when he prays, or their concentration, is on the sin. See, they know that God is judge and that he's going to judge sin. And so he's basically asking them to punish their sin. He doesn't pray them away or pray, that something bad and tragic would happen to them. But he does pray that God would do what he does. They're asking God to judge. He focuses on their sin, recognizes God's place and his own place in the battle. I think it's a blueprint for how we should react to opposition. Now we should not pray for our opposition's demise, but instead, and here's the do pray for their transformation. Don't pray for their demise, but pray for their transformation. And I'll jump ahead into chapter 6, verse 14. We're getting towards the end of this chapter. And we have another prayer, very similar. Nehemiah says, "Remember Tobiah and Sanballat, my God, because of what they have done. Remember also the prophet Noadiah, and how she and the rest of the prophets have been trying to intimidate me." So we see another character here. Someone named Noadiah was a prophetess, was speaking out against them. They had all this opposition from all around. And we're reading between the lines a little bit, but again, he's focusing on their sins. He's saying, remember what they have done. Remember their acts. Now, here's kind of the flip side of that. In that praying against their sins, what's being assumed here is that if they were to turn from their sin, they would be out of the curse, so to speak. But they would be on the other side of the prayer. So what he's focusing on is their sin and not the people themselves. In some ways, he's praying for salvation. And this is one of the areas that's fleshed out in the New Testament. Whenever we're reading the Old Testament, we need to remember that we're living on this side of Jesus' life and death and resurrection. And Jesus, he fulfilled the law, and he told us this. This is Matthew 5:44. He says, "I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Again, we have some powerful language. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. What should we do when we feel opposition? Jesus tells us loud and clear, you should pray for them. There's no more powerful tool when you're facing opposition than prayer. We've seen that time and time again. So pray for them. And when you do that, when you actually pray for your enemies, you're letting the Lord fight for you, because you're saying, listen, God, this is up to you. You know what's going on. Will you do what's right? Will you be the judge? But ultimately, we should want transformation in all people. That's why we share the gospel, and that's what our mission is as Christians. So I want to close as we finish, to close with the end of this chapter, or towards the end, verse 16. Nehemiah tells us this. He says, when all our enemies heard about this, all the surrounding nations were afraid and lost their self-confidence, because they realized that this work had been done with the help of our God. Remember, Nehemiah tells us that we need to let God fight for us, and he is at the end. The wall is built, and he says the nations, all our enemies, are afraid of us. Why? Because they could see that God was in it and that God was working. They let God fight for them, and the people saw that, and they had fear. We must do the same. For our church, that is my prayer. And here's the truth, and none of us like to think about it and admit it, but Jesus says we will face opposition. And if you're doing what's right and you're following Jesus, you will face people who hate you. Again, Jesus promised that. We shouldn't be surprised, as the Apostle Peter says. Don't be surprised when you face persecution. But we also shouldn't walk away. We should follow Nehemiah's lead and focus on the truth, face the task at hand, and pray for those around us. And I'll leave you with this. Take some time today, take some time this week for yourself to ask yourself, what does this mean for me to focus on the truth? Am I focusing on the truth? Am I facing the task at hand? Am I focused on what God has for me? And do I pray for those around me? Do I pray for my enemies? Because Jesus tells us we should. So let's remember that as we leave this morning. When opposition comes from all sides, and it will, let's let God fight for us. We pray.